I remember the sound first, not the words, not the laughter. The sound, a glass tapping against a fork, sharp, bright, demanding silence, and then my daughter-in-law's voice slicing through the restaurant like a ribbon being cut. Everyone, can we just take a moment to appreciate the woman who made tonight possible? There was polite applause, chairs scraping, heads turning. Warm golden light from the chandeliers pulled over the white tablecloths, catching in the crystal glasses. The private room smelled of roasted garlic and wine and expensive perfume. It was my husband's 70th birthday dinner. My dinner. I had organized every detail, and yet when she said those words, her eyes did not look at me. They looked past me. They landed on my son. Daniel smiled, embarrassed and pleased, and my chest tightened with a confusion I could not yet name. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, waiting for the natural correction, waiting for her to laugh and say, "Of course, we all know this was Eleanor's doing." She didn't. Instead, she lifted her glass toward him. "Daniel has been working so hard," she continued. "He wanted this night to be perfect for his father. He planned everything himself." The room erupted into applause. I felt the blood drain from my face. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard. My ears rang faintly, as if someone had struck a distant bell. I turned slowly toward my son. He was nodding, accepting the praise with a sheepish grin that used to melt my heart when he was a boy. He did not look at me. Not once. The applause went on too long. It became a wall of sound pressing against my chest. I forced a smile onto my lips, the kind I had perfected over decades of social gatherings and family events. A polite smile, a supportive smile. Inside, something cold unfurled. I saw the waiter approaching with the cake I had spent 2 afternoons selecting, tasting samples, arguing gently with the pastry chef about the exact shade of blue frosting my husband preferred. My husband squeezed my hand under the table. "Beautiful evening," he murmured. I swallowed. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "It is." Across the table, my daughter-in-law, Marissa, was glowing in the attention. She leaned into Daniel, whispering something that made him laugh. Her manicured fingers rested possessively on his sleeve. I watched them the way one watches strangers on a train, curious, detached, trying to understand their private language. Had they planned this? The thought came uninvited and absurd. Of course not. It was a simple misunderstanding, a slip of the tongue. Marissa would correct it. Daniel would stand and say something gracious. He stood. My heart lifted. He raised his glass. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," he said. "It means a lot to Dad. And to Marissa, thank you for helping me pull this together." He kissed her cheek. The room cooed in approval, and that was no mention of me. Not even an accidental glance in my direction. I sat there, my smile fixed like porcelain, and felt a slow, deliberate humiliation settle over me. It was not loud. It did not burn. It was a quiet, suffocating weight. I had spent 6 weeks planning this celebration. Every invitation, every seating arrangement, every menu choice had passed through my hands. Daniel had been too busy with work, he'd said. Marissa had nodded sympathetically when I told her I would handle it. "You're amazing at this stuff, Eleanor," she'd said. "We'd be lost without you, lost without me." The phrase echoed now with a bitter irony. The cake was placed in front of my husband. Candles flickered. Everyone sang. I joined in, my voice steady. Years of motherhood had taught me how to perform calm even when my insides were trembling. But as I watched my son and his wife bask in the glow of appreciation that belonged undeniably to me, a realization crept in. This was not a misunderstanding. This was erasure. And it was not the first time. The memory rose unbidden. A charity gala last spring where Marissa had introduced me as Daniel's mother and nothing more, skimming over my decades of volunteer work as if they were an embarrassing footnote. The family vacation where my suggestions had been dismissed until Daniel repeated them and was praised for his insight. The subtle way conversations shifted when I entered a room, as though I were a piece of furniture being politely acknowledged. I had told myself I was imagining it, that I was sensitive, that this was the natural evolution of family dynamics, the younger generation stepping forward, the older one stepping back, but sitting there in that elegant restaurant, listening to the applause fade into cheerful chatter. I felt the truth settle with crystalline clarity. I was being rewritten out of my own story. Marissa caught my eye across the table. For a split second, something flickered in her expression. Not guilt, not apology. Triumph. It was gone so quickly I might have doubted it, if not for the small, satisfied curve of her lips. She lifted her glass to me in a gesture that was almost a toast. I raised mine in return. My hand did not shake. In that moment, a decision formed, quiet, precise, and immovable. I did not know yet what shape it would take. I only knew that I would not confront her here, in front of everyone. I would not create a scene or beg for recognition. I would wait. I would watch, and when the time came, I would tell the truth. Not loudly, not cruelly, but clearly enough that no one could ever erase me again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and clinking glasses. I laughed when expected. I accepted compliments on the event with a gracious nod, even when they were misdirected toward Daniel and Marissa. I memorized every detail, every word, every glance, storing them carefully, because I understood something then that I had not fully grasped before. Respect is not lost in a single dramatic moment. It is chipped away in small, deliberate acts, and reclaiming it requires patience. When we finally stepped out into the cool night air, my husband wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "You outdid yourself," he said softly. The words warmed me more than the coat around my shoulders. I leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. "Thank you," I whispered. Behind us, Daniel and Marissa were laughing as they waited for their car. She was animated, recounting some joke from the evening. He listened with the rapt attention he used to reserve for my stories. I watched them for a moment, and I smiled, because they did not yet know what I knew. They did not know how carefully I had been keeping track, how many small truths I carried, how easily a narrative built on borrowed credit could collapse when exposed to light. The night closed around us, gentle and dark. The city hummed with distant traffic. I felt strangely calm. Humiliation had opened a door inside me, and I was ready to walk through it. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was angry. Anger is hot and restless, and what I felt was something colder, more deliberate. I lay awake beside my husband, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, and let my memories drift backward like pages turning in a book I knew by heart. If someone had asked me then whether I loved my family, I would have answered without hesitation. Love had been the organizing principle of my entire adult life. Every decision I made, every compromise I accepted, had been filtered through a simple question: what would keep us together? I met my husband when I was 23, in a grocery store of all places. He reached for the same jar of olives I was holding, and our hands collided. We laughed, and that laugh, easy, unguarded, became the foundation of everything that followed. He was steady in a way that calmed me. I was ambitious in a way that energized him. We built our life slowly, brick by careful brick. Daniel was born 3 years later, red-faced and indignant at the world. From the beginning, he was observant. He watched everything with those wide, serious eyes, as if he were taking notes on how life worked. I devoted myself to him with the quiet ferocity of a young mother determined to do everything right. I left my job at the architectural firm without regret. People told me I was brave to step away from a promising career. I didn't feel brave. I felt certain. There would be time, I thought, to return to professional ambitions. Childhood was brief. I wanted to be present for all of it. And I was. I was there for the first wobbly steps across the living room carpet, my hands outstretched in case he fell. I was there for the endless school projects that colonized our dining table, papier volcanoes, poster boards covered in careful handwriting. I was there for the heartbreaks and triumphs of adolescence, the slammed doors and tearful apologies that marked his passage into adulthood. Daniel grew into a kind man. That is what I was proudest of. He held doors open. He thanked waiters. He listened when people spoke. When he introduced me to Marissa for the first time, I remember thinking that he had chosen someone bright and sharp-edged, a woman who would challenge him. She arrived at our house wearing a navy dress and a smile that seemed, at first glance, warm. She brought a bottle of wine and complimented my garden with practiced enthusiasm. "It's beautiful," she said, touching a rose as if it were fragile porcelain. "I wish I had your patience." We talked for hours that evening. She was articulate, funny, full of stories about her work in marketing. I liked her. More than that, I was relieved. Mothers carry a quiet fear that no one will ever be good enough for their children. Marissa seemed more than good enough. She seemed perfect. The wedding was a blur of white flowers and happy tears. I stood in the front row, watching my son slip a ring onto her finger, and felt a complicated mixture of joy and loss. He was stepping into a new life, one that did not orbit around me. That was as it should be. I reminded myself of this often in the months that followed Dottie first. Our relationship settled into an easy rhythm. Sunday dinners at our house became a tradition. Marissa would help me in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with swift, efficient movements. We talked about recipes, about work, about the small absurdities of daily life. But even in those early days, there were moments tiny, almost invisible, that unsettled me. She had a way of correcting me that was wrapped in politeness. If I misremembered a date or a detail, she would tilt her head and say, lightly, "I think it was actually." The emphasis on actually was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel began to defer to her version of events, even when I knew mine was accurate. I told myself it was natural. They were building their own partnership. Of course, they would develop a shared perspective. My role was to support, not to compete. Still, I noticed how conversations gradually shifted. When guests complimented a dish I had cooked, Marissa would jump in to explain how she had suggested a particular ingredient. When we hosted gatherings, she positioned herself at the center of the room, orchestrating interactions with effortless charm. I found myself stepping back, allowing her to shine. There is a particular loneliness that comes from becoming peripheral in spaces you once anchored. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with tears. It is a soft fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I adapted. I told myself that this was the natural order of things. Families evolve. Roles change. My mother had once confided that the hardest part of aging was learning when to speak and when to remain silent. I thought of her often. Then came the grandchildren. When Marissa announced her pregnancy, Daniel called us in a voice trembling with excitement. I cried after I hung up the phone, overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of our family. A grandchild felt like a miracle. A second chance to experience the wonder of childhood without the exhausting anxieties of first-time parenthood. Their daughter, Lily, arrived on a rainy morning in April. I held her in the hospital room, marveling at the impossibly small fingers curled around mine. Marissa watched me with an expression I could not quite decipher, protective, perhaps, or wary. "You'll have to teach me everything," she said with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll learn," I assured her gently. Every mother does. I offered help in the weeks that followed, careful not to intrude. I brought meals, folded laundry, rocked Lily to sleep when Marissa's exhaustion etched shadows beneath her eyes. Sometimes she accepted my assistance with gratitude. Other times, she bristled. "We've got it," she would say, her tone polite but firm. "You don't have to come over so much." I retreated when she asked. The last thing I wanted was to be the overbearing mother-in-law everyone jokes about. I prided myself on respecting boundaries. Yet I could not ignore the growing sense that I was being managed, gently steered to the edges of their lives. Daniel seemed oblivious. When I mentioned feeling uncertain about how often to visit, he squeezed my hand and smiled. "Mom, you worry too much," he said. "Marissa just likes doing things her way. It's not personal." Not personal. The phrase echoed in my mind long after our conversation ended. How could it not be personal? Families are built from personal threads, preferences, sensitivities, histories woven together. To pretend otherwise felt like a denial of the very intimacy that defined us. As Lily grew, I watched Marissa curate their family narrative with increasing precision. Social media posts showcased a life of effortless harmony, carefully staged photos of smiling faces, captions celebrating milestones I sometimes learned about online before hearing them directly. In those images, I was often absent. When I was included, it was as a background figure, a blurred presence at the edge of the frame. Friends would comment on how lucky Daniel and Marissa were to have such a supportive extended family. I would read those words and feel a strange disconnect between the public story and my private experience. I did not confront her. I did not accuse. Instead, I observed. Observation became a habit, then a discipline. I began to notice patterns. The way Marissa redirected praise, the subtle exclusions, the careful shaping of perception. None of it was overt enough to challenge without seeming petty. Each incident, taken alone, was trivial. Together, they formed a mosaic that was impossible to ignore. Through it all, my love for my family remained unchanged. If anything, it deepened, complicated by the ache of distance. I adored Lily. I cherished the moments when she ran into my arms, her laughter bright and unfiltered. Those moments anchored me, reminding me why I endured the quieter hurts, because families are not abandoned lightly. They are fought for in silence, in patience, in the daily decision to stay engaged even when engagement is painful. As dawn crept into our bedroom that sleepless night, I turned onto my side and studied my husband's face. Time had etched fine lines around his eyes, but his expression in sleep was peaceful, untouched by the tensions that occupied my thoughts. I realized then that my struggle was not just about recognition. It was about legacy, about the story our family would tell itself in years to come. Would I be remembered as a footnote, a supporting character in a narrative I had helped create? Or would I find a way to assert my place with grace and clarity? The humiliation at the restaurant had crystallized a truth I could no longer ignore. Something in our family dynamic was out of balance, and balance, once lost, does not restore itself without intention. I closed my eyes and made a quiet promise to myself. I would understand the shape of this imbalance completely. I would trace it to its roots. And when I acted because I knew now that I eventually would, my actions would be guided not by bitterness, but by a calm commitment to truth. Sleep finally claimed me with that promise echoing softly in my mind. And when I woke, I felt the first stirrings of a resolve that would carry me through everything that followed. It started in small, almost imperceptible ways, the kind of slights that whisper rather than shout. At first, I questioned myself. Was I reading too much into ordinary family interactions? But the pattern was there, clear and relentless, and it began to weigh on me with the quiet pressure of water filling a glass. The first time I really noticed, Daniel and Marissa had invited me over for Sunday brunch. I arrived with a homemade quiche, still warm from the oven. I could smell the buttery crust from the car. I imagined the smile that would light Daniel's face, the way Lily would toddle toward me with her arms outstretched. That was how it had always been, small gestures of care returned with warmth. But that morning, the greeting was different. Daniel shook my hand formally, a tightness in his shoulders that had never been there before. Marissa offered a polite nod. Lily, sensing the tension, hung close to her mother's leg. I made this quiche, I said, setting the dish on the counter. Thought it would be nice for brunch. Marissa smiled, that carefully measured smile. Oh, thank you, she said, and gestured vaguely. I think we've got plenty of food. I froze, fork halfway to the oven. Plenty of food? Did she just dismiss it? Daniel's eyes flicked toward me briefly before he looked away. I forced myself to breathe. It's fine, I said, placing the quiche in the fridge. The tension in the room settled into a quiet, uncomfortable hum. I began to notice the subtleties, the way she corrected Daniel when he tried to tell a story from our family history, the way she would reinterpret events to make herself central. At first, I laughed it off. Perhaps she didn't mean anything by it. Perhaps she was simply eager to assert herself as Daniel's partner, as Lily's mother. But then it happened at the dinner table one evening, and I knew this was no coincidence. I had prepared a roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, Daniel's favorite. The aroma filled the house. I had set the table meticulously, with polished silverware and folded napkins. As we sat down, Marissa began talking about her day at work. Daniel listened intently, nodding and laughing at her jokes. I started to tell a story about Daniel's first baseball game as a child, thinking it would bring warmth to the room. Before I could even reach the punchline, she interrupted. "Actually, that reminds me of something Lily did at school today," she said, steering the conversation toward herself. I hesitated. Daniel looked between us, his smile awkward. "That's right," he said softly, giving me a glance I thought might redeem the moment. But Marissa was already speaking again, weaving a narrative that left me invisible. By the time the evening ended, I felt the slow burn of erasure, a subtle but unmistakable humiliation. It wasn't cruel, not overtly. It was quieter, more dangerous. It was the kind of disrespect that seeps into your bones and makes you question your own presence. I tried to address it indirectly at first, offering gentle suggestions in conversation, small corrections phrased with care. "I remember that slightly differently," I would say, or, "Actually, Daniel loved that part of the game." Daniel would nod politely, but the narrative had already shifted. Marissa would smile knowingly, as though she had won some private game. I began to observe everything, silently cataloging the incidents, the way my opinions were summarized and reframed, the way my involvement in planning events was minimized, the way my efforts were acknowledged only when filtered through Daniel or Marissa. One Sunday, I found myself standing in the hallway, watching Marissa show Lily how to fold laundry. She spoke with such authority, such certainty, that even I, the grandmother, felt peripheral. When Lily looked up and asked if I wanted to help, Marissa's smile froze ever so slightly. The briefest hint of control. I didn't react. I simply observed. The disrespect was not only about control. It was about perception, about how the family saw me. I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how much care I poured into the house, the meals, the holidays, it was being quietly redirected to highlight someone else's contribution. The accolades that should have been mine were being rerouted with precision, leaving me as background scenery in the story of my own family. And it was escalating. At the weekly coffee gathering with Daniel's colleagues, Marissa had taken it upon herself to introduce me. "This is Daniel's mother, Eleanor. She's been such a great help with everything at home." That lingered, a subtle diminishment. I had helped raise Daniel, managed the house, planned the holidays, cared for my husband, supported my son and granddaughter. Everything I had done in decades of family life was reduced to help. I kept my composure, smiling politely, nodding. But inside, a quiet rage began to take shape, the kind that doesn't explode, but smolders, waiting for the right moment. I began to catalog her behaviors systematically. The dismissive gestures, the slight redirections of credit, the subtle undermining of my authority. I wrote notes to myself late at night, in a small journal hidden in the bedroom drawer. I detailed each incident, time, place, people present, what was said, what was left unsaid. This became my private record, my way of preserving the truth while the narrative around me shifted. I learned to sit in silence, to watch and listen, to let the small humiliations roll over me without a show of emotion. It was a strange kind of power, this silence. While they believed they were erasing me, I was watching, remembering, collecting. And with each small act of disrespect, I felt my resolve harden. I was learning patience. I was learning strategy. And I was beginning to see that this story, the story of my family, my contributions, my love, was mine to tell. And when the time came, I would tell it. Not in anger, not in shouting, but in a way that would leave no doubt. Because being erased in silence requires a response just as quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable. And I was ready to begin. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. A misdirected compliment here, a carefully orchestrated omission there. But over weeks and months, the pattern became undeniable, and the quiet weight of it pressed down on me in ways I could no longer ignore. It happened one evening at a neighborhood block party. I had spent hours baking pies, arranging flowers from my garden, and even handmade little favors for the children. I had arrived with Daniel, Lily toddling at our heels, and anticipated warm smiles and a few words of thanks. Instead, Marissa arrived 5 minutes after us, radiant and impeccable as always. She greeted the neighbors first, laughing easily at jokes I hadn't even heard. When someone mentioned the pies, she stepped in smoothly, handing out slices and saying, "Eleanor made them, but I suggested the flavors." I froze mid-step, holding a plate like it weighed 100 pounds. Daniel stood beside me, a polite smile plastered on his face, but his eyes were hesitant, as if he didn't know whether to defend me or let the moment pass. The neighbors, oblivious, nodded and thanked Marissa, and I realized I was being written out again. Later, in the car, Daniel spoke softly. "Mom, she's just trying to help. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally." I stared out the window at the fading sunlight, gripping the edge of my seat. Every bone in my body wanted to snap, to demand acknowledgement, to correct the narrative. But I said nothing. Instead, I said, "It's fine." It was not fine. But silence had become my weapon. Observation, my shield. The next incident came during a family vacation, the first since Lily had been born. I had suggested a series of excursions, careful to include activities that Daniel and Marissa would enjoy, things that would create lasting memories for Lily. I had printed itineraries, packed picnic baskets, mapped out routes. Every detail had been considered. Marissa rewrote it all. She rearranged the schedule, discarded my suggestions, and presented the plan to Daniel as if it had been her idea all along. I felt my heart tighten as I watched Daniel nod in agreement, unaware of my months of preparation. I smiled politely and helped pack the bags she had deemed necessary. By the third day, the vacation had subtly turned into Marissa's showcase. She directed activities, posed for photographs, curated the story that would later appear on her social media. Each post highlighted her thoughtfulness, her creativity, her parenting prowess. I was in the pictures, yes, but always slightly off-center, a supporting role in my own family's life. The crescendo came one evening at dinner. We were eating at a small lakeside restaurant, the kind with dim lanterns and wooden tables. I had reserved the table and arranged for a local musician to play Lily's favorite songs. It was meant to be a quiet celebration, an intimate acknowledgement of the family's milestones. Marissa had other ideas. As the musician began playing, she leaned over and whispered to Daniel. Soon, he was telling the story of the outing to our table neighbors, recounting it as if it were entirely his and Marissa's conception. I sat silently, knife and fork in hand, my shoulders stiff, when Lily clapped her hands and exclaimed, "Grandma made it." Marissa laughed lightly, a smooth, airy sound, and said, "Oh, Daniel helped too." I felt my chest tighten. It was not loud, it was not cruel, but it was deliberate. Every smile, every gentle correction, every subtle redirection was a tiny erasure. And in that moment, I understood fully that the battlefield of our family had shifted. It was not a single betrayal that hurt most. It was the accumulation. It was the constant undermining, the quiet rewriting of contributions, the invisibility in plain sight. I began to keep a mental ledger, noting every slight, every misattributed effort, every instance where my voice was diminished or ignored. I cataloged them with precision. The bakery incident, the vacation, the restaurant. They formed a chain, each link connecting to the next. And then came the holidays, the true test of family dynamics. Christmas had always been my domain. I would plan for weeks, baking cookies, decorating the house, orchestrating presents in a careful, thoughtful sequence that delighted everyone. This year, I noticed Marissa's subtle maneuvers almost immediately. She arrived first, positioning the tree in a slightly different spot than I had planned, arranging ornaments in a way that drew the eye to her contributions. She whispered to Daniel about how wonderful it all looks, ensuring his attention was focused on her. When guests arrived, she welcomed them, directing them toward the appetizers she had chosen, ignoring the hundreds of hours I had spent planning the evening. When it was time to hand out presents, Marissa orchestrated the opening of gifts, highlighting her own thoughtfulness and leaving mine unnoticed until an afterthought. By the end of the night, I felt the familiar, suffocating weight of invisibility settled over me. Daniel said nothing. He smiled politely, occasionally thanking me for a dish or a decoration, but always in a tone that suggested obligation rather than acknowledgement. The breaking point, though, came unexpectedly. During the New Year's Eve gathering at our home, I had prepared a toast, a heartfelt reflection on the family's year, celebrating our shared joys and challenges. I had spent days crafting the words, practicing them late into the night so they would sound natural, sincere, and loving. When I stood, glasses raised, and began speaking, Marissa interrupted softly, almost politely, but with enough authority to redirect everyone's attention. "Oh, Eleanor, that reminds me Daniel has something to share too," she said, and the room shifted. All eyes were on him. He laughed nervously and offered a brief, shallow toast. I finished my words quietly, the applause minimal, and sat down, my cheeks burning with an anger I refused to voice. It was then that I realized the scale of what had been done. This was not incidental. It was not accidental. It was a systematic erasure, a careful manipulation to ensure that my contributions, my voice, my presence were subordinated to theirs. That night, I walked alone on the frosty streets, the city quiet around me. I let the cold bite my cheeks, let the wind sweep through my hair, and allowed the hurt to rise fully to the surface. I would not cry. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would remember. I would catalog. I would wait. I understood then that this was more than disrespect. It was a challenge, a test of my patience, my resolve, my understanding of power, and for the first time, I began to consider that the only way to reclaim my place was not to argue or confront immediately, but to act with precision, to turn observation into strategy, to let them continue their slow march of erasure while I prepared a response that no one could ignore, because respect, I realized, once lost in silence, can only be regained with deliberate, intelligent force, and I was learning how to wield it. It happened on a bright Saturday morning, the kind that promised warmth and laughter. The neighborhood was alive with the chatter of children, the hum of lawnmowers, and the scent of freshly cut grass. I had been planning this particular family gathering for weeks, a small barbecue to celebrate Daniel's promotion. Invitations had gone out, decorations were arranged, and the grill was ready to sizzle. I arrived first, carrying trays of marinated vegetables and skewers of chicken, feeling that familiar mix of anticipation and pride. I had spent hours perfecting the marinades, testing combinations until each flavor was balanced, every dish worthy of the occasion. And then Marissa arrived, dressed in her crisp white blouse, her hair perfectly styled. She greeted everyone with an easy smile, a practiced cheerfulness that drew attention immediately. The first sign of what was to come came when she stepped toward the grill, plucking a skewer from my carefully arranged tray. "I thought we'd try cooking these over direct flame," she said brightly. "You know, really get that smoky flavor." I hesitated, trying to mask the flicker of irritation. "I tested them exactly for this grill," I said softly, but she barely glanced at me. Daniel, standing beside her, nodded in agreement. "Sounds good," he said, and just like that, my labor, my careful attention to detail was redirected. I stood to the side, hands folded, as she rearranged the trays and began cooking, narrating every step to an audience of neighbors who had gathered to watch. I told myself to remain calm, to remain silent. But the next moment, when she told a neighbor, "Daniel and I planned this menu together. Eleanor just helped with the prep," I felt something inside me break. I tried to step in politely. "Actually, the recipe was mine. I spent days adjusting it to make sure." She cut me off smoothly, smiling. "Oh, Eleanor helped." "Yes, but it was Daniel's idea to do it this way. Isn't that right, honey?" He nodded, avoiding my eyes. The humiliation hit me like ice. It was quiet, subtle, but sharp enough to leave a sting that radiated from my chest down to my fingers. I forced a smile, turned toward the serving table, and began arranging plates. The neighbors clapped politely at her effortless hosting, oblivious to the reality that it didn't end there. Later that afternoon, when it was time for Lily's little birthday cake, yes, another cake, Because Marissa insisted she had found a better baker, Marissa announced to everyone. Daniel and I organized everything for Lily today. Eleanor helped, of course, but she really just supervised. I felt my hands clench. Every ounce of restraint I had built over months teetered. I wanted to shout, to throw my hands into the air, to demand recognition in front of everyone. But I didn't. I swallowed the rage, feeling it coil like a serpent inside me. The final blow came as Daniel, standing beside her, accepted congratulations from the neighbors for the perfect event and the thoughtful arrangements. Not a word of acknowledgement for me. Not a glance. I felt invisible. I left the gathering early that day, claiming a headache. Outside, in the quiet shade of the side yard, I let myself breathe deeply. The cold wind bit at my face, but it felt good, cleansing, clarifying. For hours, I replayed the events in my mind, cataloging each slight, each carefully crafted erasure. I could still see the way Marissa's eyes sparkled with triumph, hear the polite laughter of the neighbors, feel the weight of my son's silence. Humiliation is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive in moments of drama or confrontation. Often, it creeps in quietly, delivered with smiles and polite words, until you realize the narrative has been stolen from you entirely. But in that quiet, I also felt something else: clarity. I understood now that I could no longer allow this pattern to continue unchecked. I could not rely on subtle hints or polite corrections. If I wanted to reclaim my place, my dignity, my voice, my role as the matriarch, I would need strategy, patience, and precision. I began thinking in terms of moves and countermoves. I would not retaliate in anger. I would respond with intelligence and foresight. I would allow them to continue unaware while I prepared my return. Every slight, every erasure, every redirection of credit would be noted, remembered, and catalogued. The breaking point was not the end, it was the catalyst. And as I walked home that evening, the autumn leaves crunching under my feet, I made a silent vow. They had taken the stage, thinking I was finished. They did not know the depth of my resolve, the meticulous care with which I had recorded their actions, the patience I had cultivated over decades of life experience. I would wait. I would observe. And when the time came, I would reveal the truth with a calm so absolute, so precise, that it would leave no room for denial or dismissal. This was no longer about being seen. This was about reclaiming the narrative entirely, because humiliation, once felt, can be transformed into something far more powerful. Strategy, and I had become a master of it. After that day, I retreated into a world that was at once quiet and deliberate. A world of observation, calculation, and patience. I moved through the family's routines with the same warmth and care as before, smiling at Lily, preparing meals, attending gatherings, but inside, every glance, every word, every subtle gesture was being catalogued. I became the silent witness to a narrative that was quietly, carefully being rewritten around me. I knew I could not confront Marissa directly. That would have been obvious, reactive, messy. It would have satisfied neither my need for dignity nor my desire for justice. No, the only way to reclaim my place was to act with patience, to collect evidence, to allow the unfolding story to reveal itself fully before I intervened. I began by documenting everything in a small, leather-bound journal I kept hidden in my bedside drawer. Each incident was recorded with meticulous detail. Date, time, setting, who was present, what was said, and importantly, what was left unsaid. The dinner where she redirected credit for the quiche. The neighborhood block party, the vacation itinerary she had rewritten. Every slight and every subtle humiliation, all catalogued with the precision of a historian chronicling a life that others tried to erase. But it was not only about cataloging. I started analyzing patterns. I noticed the exact way she would redirect praise, the timing of her comments, the words she used to subtly diminish me while appearing polite. There was an artistry to her erasure, a precision that I needed to understand fully before acting. I also observed Daniel carefully. I had always loved him deeply, and my desire to protect him did not diminish because of Marissa's behavior. Yet I noticed how easily he deflected, how often he deferred to Marissa even when my knowledge or contributions were relevant. I began to see where my influence had waned and where I could reclaim it not through argument, but through carefully constructed presence and action. I started small. At Sunday brunches, I would deliberately plan moments where my contributions could not be overlooked. If I baked, I made dishes that required subtle attention to detail that no one could replicate without noticing. If I arranged a family event, I included elements that Marissa could not anticipate, hidden touches that would speak for themselves. At the same time, I honed my emotional composure. I trained myself to smile when my efforts were dismissed, to nod politely when credit was redirected. Outwardly, I was the picture of calm, warmth, and generosity. Inwardly, I was the strategist, observing every move, cataloging every slight, preparing for the decisive moment when all of it would matter. I began to notice how much power is in silence. People speak freely when they believe you are passive, unaware, or deferential. I let them continue in their assumptions. Marissa assumed I would accept my reduced role. Daniel assumed I would not react. They were wrong. I also cultivated my allies carefully, quietly. Friends, neighbors, and even a few family members who had long respected my voice became subtle conduits of acknowledgement. I did not ask for favors or intervention. I merely let the truth of my care, my attention, and my presence be seen in small, undeniable ways. Little gestures, bringing flowers for an event, offering guidance in a way that naturally drew others to my experience, became evidence that I could not be dismissed. During this time, I also reflected deeply on what I wanted from this confrontation. I did not desire vengeance in the crude, dramatic sense. I wanted clarity, acknowledgement, and balance restored. I wanted my family to see the truth of my contributions and respect them without the need for argument. I wanted dignity for myself, for my husband, and for Lily. There were days when I questioned the patience I was cultivating. The quiet humiliation weighed on me, like a low hum beneath the surface of daily life. I reminded myself constantly that acting too early would diminish the impact of the truth. If I revealed myself before the time was right, it would appear reactive, petty, emotional. But if I waited, if I allowed the narrative to unfold fully, then the truth would be undeniable. And so I waited. I observed how Marissa organized events, how she presented herself, how she subtly claimed credit. I noted the smallest details, the timing of her comments, the way she positioned herself in family photos, even the tone of her voice when she described accomplishments. Each observation added to the growing mosaic of understanding. I was assembling a map of influence, misdirection, and control that I could use to reclaim my place without confrontation. I also began preparing moments that would speak for themselves. Small interventions that, though seemingly inconsequential, would highlight my presence, knowledge, and care without giving away my strategy. A perfectly timed comment that demonstrated expertise. A dish served exactly as needed, unnoticed until appreciated. A gentle act of kindness that revealed foresight. Through this careful cultivation, I learned something essential. Power does not always demand loud assertion. Power is often quiet. Power is the patience to observe, the intelligence to plan, and the precision to act when the moment cannot be ignored. By the end of the silent strategy phase, I had a full understanding of the family dynamics, the patterns of erasure, and the subtle manipulations at play. I had built a mental map of influence, carefully noting how each person perceived me and each other. I was ready, and when the time came, I would reveal the truth not with anger, but with calm, deliberate clarity, a revelation that could not be ignored, denied, or diminished. The quiet, patient work had been exhausting, but it had prepared me. The stage was set. The players had assumed I was passive. They had underestimated the depth of my resolve, and they did not know the storm that would arrive. Not as chaos, but as truth. The moment arrived quietly, with no fanfare, no dramatic announcement. That was the point. True power is subtle, almost invisible until it is undeniable. I had watched, planned, and waited, and now every carefully observed slight, every slighted acknowledgement, Every erased contribution would converge into clarity. It began at a family gathering for Lily's 5th birthday. I had been tasked with organizing the event, a responsibility I accepted with my usual quiet diligence. Invitations were sent, decorations were chosen. The menu finalized, all of it infused with my touch, my attention to detail. The things only someone who knew this family as intimately as I did could manage. Marissa arrived, as always, radiant and poised, immediately taking command. She began arranging the party favors, directing the neighbors, positioning herself as the central figure in Lily's special day. Daniel smiled and deferred, as he always had, caught in her orbit, but this time, I was ready. As guests arrived, I moved quietly among them, offering guidance, subtly directing attention to the flow of events. I smiled, nodded, laughed in all the right places, a masterful performance of normalcy. Yet each small action was calculated, deliberate. Each moment carefully constructed to highlight my influence without appearing to dominate. When it came time to cut the cake, the turning point unfolded. Marissa, with her usual air of ownership, lifted Lily to the table, announcing to everyone, "Daniel and I picked this cake for Lily, isn't it perfect?" I waited, I smiled, then I spoke, softly, confidently, without any hint of anger. In fact, I worked with the baker for weeks to make sure Lily's favorite flavors were just right. And the decoration, these tiny fondant stars? Lily herself helped me choose the colors. A pause fell across the table. Eyes turned toward me. Guests murmured. Daniel's mouth opened slightly, caught between surprise and realization. Marissa's smile faltered, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. I continued, calm and deliberate. I wanted this cake to be special for Lily, not only as a celebration but as a memory she could treasure. Every detail, every choice was made with her in mind. No one could interrupt. My voice was steady, authoritative, yet warm. The words were neither accusatory nor angry. They were simply truth. And truth, when stated clearly, is undeniable. Guests began complimenting the cake, its flavor, its design, and this time, the acknowledgement could not be redirected. Every glance, every nod, every word of praise was directed toward me. I did not gloat. I smiled, letting the moment speak for itself. Marissa's usual ease dissolved. She tried to interject, to reassert control, but Daniel, for the first time in months, looked at her and said softly, "Mom did all of this, actually." Her eyes widened, just slightly. The room shifted. I did not need to say more. The pattern was broken. The narrative had been reclaimed. Later, during the gift opening, the subtle orchestration continued. I had prepared a seating arrangement that allowed me to guide interactions, to highlight contributions, to quietly ensure that my presence could not be ignored. Every gift I handed to Lily, every suggestion I made for the games, every detail I had meticulously crafted became visible, acknowledged, and appreciated. By the end of the day, the family had subtly shifted. Daniel's respect for my contributions was evident in the warmth of his gestures. Marissa, though still present, no longer held absolute control of the narrative. She realized, though she would not admit it aloud, that my influence was neither diminished nor erasable. The revelation was quiet, controlled, and complete. I had not shouted, not argued, not demanded recognition. I had allowed the truth to manifest itself through my actions, my preparation, and my patience. And the result was far more powerful than any immediate confrontation could have achieved. That night, as I walked home with Lily tucked safely in my arms, I reflected on the day. The subtle triumph did not feel like revenge in the bitter sense. It was a restoration of balance, a reclaiming of dignity, a quiet assertion of authority that had always been mine by right. And in that moment, I understood fully, power is not always loud. Sometimes it is a gentle but unwavering insistence on the truth. Sometimes it is the patience to wait, the wisdom to plan, and the courage to act with precision. For months, I had been invisible, dismissed, quietly humiliated. But now, the narrative had shifted. My contributions were visible, acknowledged, undeniable. And the family, for the first time in a long while, could see the truth of who I was, not as a background figure, not as someone whose influence could be quietly erased, but as the center of the story I had always been an integral part of. This was not about punishment. This was about clarity, respect, and balance. And it had been delivered with the calm dignity that only years of experience, patience, and observation can create. The days that followed were strange, almost surreal. The subtle power shift had taken place, yet life did not explode into drama. Instead, it unfolded quietly, the kind of ripple that eventually reaches every corner, leaving change in its wake without anyone noticing. At first, Daniel was the first to adjust. He had always loved me, but in the months before the cake incident, he had allowed Marissa's subtle redirections to shape his perception of our family's dynamics. After that day, though, his eyes opened in a way they hadn't before. He began acknowledging my contributions again, often privately at first. In small gestures, a lingering glance of appreciation, a nod when I suggested a detail for Lily's activities, a whispered thank you in moments when no one else was watching. He did not announce it. He did not proclaim it to the world. But I saw it. I felt it. And it mattered more than any public acknowledgement could. Marissa, of course, reacted differently. At first, there was a slight tension in the air, almost imperceptible, but I noticed it immediately. Her attempts to redirect praise faltered. She no longer spoke over me with the same confidence, no longer positioned herself as the primary architect of events without at least a nod to my role. She adjusted subtly, almost reluctantly. One afternoon, as I helped Lily with a craft project, Marissa stood nearby watching. Lily handed me a small, messy sculpture she had made from clay, beaming proudly. "You know," Marissa said softly, almost conversationally, "I think we all learned a lot from how you handled Lily's birthday. The planning, the cake, it was impressive." I smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction that required no triumphalism. "Thank you," I said, simple, calm, acknowledging her attempt at recognition without resentment. She nodded, almost shyly. The family gatherings changed too. Friends and neighbors noticed at first. They began asking me questions about how I organized events, what my tips were for cooking, decorating, and managing family milestones. They treated me with the respect that had always been mine but had been obscured for a time. Even Lily, in her own childlike innocence, seemed to sense the shift. She sought my guidance more confidently, sat closer to me when we read together, and smiled more brightly when I offered her small choices in crafts and activities. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public acknowledgement demanded. The shift had been so quiet, so deliberate, that it left no room for denial. Recognition came naturally, almost reluctantly at first, but inevitably, and in the quiet of those moments, I realized something essential. The true power of reclaiming one's place in a family does not lie in proving others wrong. It lies in allowing the truth to emerge, in asserting oneself with patience, dignity, and calm intelligence. The emotional fallout for Marissa was subtle, but unmistakable. She adjusted her behavior, no longer attempting to erase me, though she continued to seek influence in her own way. Daniel's loyalty was restored, not because of conflict, but because he now saw clearly the depth of my contributions and care. Lily thrived in the balance, experiencing both the love of her mother and the steady guidance of her grandmother without confusion or tension. I reflected on how much I had endured before this moment, the quiet humiliation, the subtle erasures, the slow suffocation of being ignored. And I realized that enduring it, cataloging it, and responding strategically had not only restored my place but strengthened my understanding of patience, observation, and the quiet power of truth. I was no longer simply a participant in my family's story. I had become, quietly and definitively, one of its pillars. And in that position, I could guide, nurture, and influence in ways that were visible, undeniable, and deeply respected. In the end, the emotional fallout was not dramatic. There were no shouted apologies or forced reconciliations. There was only a calm shift, a subtle adjustment of relationships, and the steady restoration of balance. And for the first time in a long while, I felt fully seen, not in the way of loud acclaim, but in the quiet, enduring acknowledgement of the people who mattered most. The house was quiet that evening. Lily had been tucked into bed, Daniel had retired to his study, and Marissa was softly organizing a few things in the kitchen. I stood by the window, gazing out at the fading light, letting the last warmth of the day settle over me. The events of the past months, the subtle humiliations, the careful observations, the strategic patience, and finally the quiet reclamation of my place replayed in my mind like the final notes of a symphony. I realized something profound. The moments that once wounded me so deeply had taught me patience, self-awareness, and the value of deliberate action. Humiliation, I had learned, is not simply about public embarrassment. It is about the slow erosion of recognition, the quiet rewriting of one's story. And the antidote is not anger, but clarity, calm, and the courage to act precisely when the moment is right. I thought of Marissa. I did not feel hatred, nor did I feel triumph in the petty sense. I felt recognition of her skill, the subtlety with which she tried to control narratives, and the quiet satisfaction of having navigated it with intelligence and grace. We were both mothers now, and our roles would inevitably overlap, but the balance had shifted. Respect, once withheld, had been quietly restored. Daniel entered the room, closing the door softly behind him. He stood beside me, hand on my shoulder. There was a warmth in his eyes that I had not seen for months, the acknowledgement of my presence, my patience, and my enduring care. "You handled everything beautifully," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I'm proud of you." I smiled, letting the simple words wash over me. It was never about pride or recognition alone. It was about dignity, the restoration of balance, the quiet reaffirmation of love and respect. I thought of Lily, asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the subtle tensions and triumphs that had unfolded in her family. My love for her had been a guiding force throughout this ordeal. I had learned that to care for someone deeply is to sometimes endure invisibility and quiet humiliation, but also to act decisively when the truth demands recognition. As I stood there, watching the last light fade, I felt a calm sense of completeness. The strategy had worked, the balance had been restored, and my place both in the family and in the story of our lives was secure. I reflected on the journey, the shock of betrayal, the quiet accumulation of slights, the careful observation, the patient strategy, and the ultimate deliberate revelation of truth. Each phase had been necessary. Each moment had taught me something essential about power, patience, and the enduring strength of love. And I realized, finally, that revenge, true revenge, is not about hurting others. It is about reclaiming one's own voice, asserting one's dignity, and restoring balance in a way that commands respect rather than fear. It is quiet, it is intelligent, and it is lasting. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift ever so slightly. The family I loved was whole again. Not in the way I had imagined it, perhaps, but in a deeper, more enduring way. And I, too, was whole, because in the end, the story belongs to those who live it. And I had reclaimed mine with patience, with strategy, and with quiet, unwavering strength. I turned from the window, ready to step back into the warmth of my home, my family, and the life I had nurtured with care, patience, and love. And for the first time in months, I felt truly seen.